Okay, before we give this module a run, let's go ahead and demonstrate one more aspect of a dynamic query, which is its ability to be adjusted based on conditionals. So we've talked about that before, but let's actually see that in action. So go ahead and go to your module directory and open up the 6th step, which is called dynamic query. Go ahead and copy the entire code and paste it over the code that's currently in your trails.module file. What we're doing in this version of the module file is adding a new page, and in the page we're going to be showing a list of history, but that aggregates all of user history, but it will show a unique color for each user so we can easily delineate between them, and also the page will accept as a parameter through the URL the session ID or the user ID of the group of history that is currently going to be viewed. And so what we're going to do is take that value that's in the query string of the URL, and we're going to pull that in as a condition into our query. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at what's changed here. Go ahead and scroll up to the top of the code, and we're going to scroll back down to trails_menu. This is an implementation of hook menu. And we've added a new page at the path, trails/history. It's called trail page, and the description is a full paginated list of pages visited. And then the page callback is trails history page. And so this function, trails history page, is the only function that we've added to this file. So let's go ahead and scroll down to the bottom here. And we'll look at the function, trails history page here. The first thing we're doing is building a query. As a start, we're using the dbSelect function. Now, previously we used dbInsert and dbDelete, and then we used dbQuery for a static select function. But this is a dynamic select function. And we're passing it as a first parameter the name of the table. As a second parameter, which we haven't illustrated yet, we can add an alias for this table, which will make it easier to select fields and sometimes necessary in order to join several tables that are actually the same table, and we need unique aliases for each one, for example. Just like with dbInsert and dbDelete, we can chain conditions and fields and multiple other methods onto this statement. So our first step is using an extend method, which allows us to add some additional parameters and behaviors to this query simply by adding this value. This pagerDefault extension allows us to render a query, a paginated query, very simply, and we'll see just how simple it is as we work through the code. Next, we're making sure to order by timestamp descending. And next we're adding fields. So you recognize fields from our dbInsert statement, but in this case we're grabbing fields to return as values rather than insert. And we're passing it the alias for this table, which will say we want to grab everything in this table, every field that can be returned. So it's like an asterisk in a where statement. And finally we're using the limit method to set how many we want to return. And this will work with the pagerDefault extension to create that paginated version of our page. The next step is to adjust this query based on the value that's being passed in the URL. So we're using a function called arg, which will allow us to get an argument from the URL. Now, every item that's separated with a slash in the URL is considered an argument. So the first argument would be trails, the second would be history, and the third is going to be our unique value that we're going to use as a condition for our query. So if the argument is numeric, we're going to assume that it's a user ID that's being passed. And so we're going to add to our query by adding a condition that the UID is the value of the argument. If it's not numeric, then we're going to check to see if it's blank, and if it's not, we're going to add a condition to check for the argument value in the session ID. So now we've demonstrated how a query can be dynamic, we're checking various conditions and we're changing the query to do that. Now, if you imagine what it would be like working with a static query and trying to make these adjustments, it's a lot uglier and more difficult to work with, and especially if you're expecting other people to work with it too. So this is nice and clean. Our final step for this query is to execute it. So we're doing that here, and we're running the execute. And the return value from this is going to be a result set. Next, we're going to loop through that result set and render it as some HTML. In this first line, what we're doing is taking the session ID of this row, and we're running it through a PHP function called MD5, which will change it into a hexadecimal hash. And the fact that it's hexadecimal means that we can then take a chunk off of it and use that as a unique identifier for a color. So if we want to just add a little bit of niceness to our table of results and add a unique color for each session, this is one way we could do it. So we're taking this hexadecimal value and then we're grabbing the first 6 characters in the string using Drupal substring right here, and we're returning this as a color. Ultimately, we're going to want to render this result set as a table using the theme table function, which is down here, and that expects an array for the rows item, and that contains rows of data, as well as a header that includes some headings for the table headers. So we're building up our rows array here. Our first item in this row is simply a div with a little bit of styling attached to it to set the width, height, and float it left and give it a little bit of margin on its right. So basically this will be this little box that floats to the left of the session ID, which is what we're adding here at the end of the div. And then we're adding in the color as the background for this styling of this div. So that's the first row, or the first column. The second column is going to be a link. We're running the title as the text and the path from the row as the path, and we're creating a link through the L function here. In the final column, we're using Drupal's format interval function to format a time interval nicely in something like 2 minutes, 3 seconds ago. So what we're going to do is take now, which can be pulled in through the request time constant, and subtract the timestamp defined for this row. And this will be the seconds between now and that time. And then we're adding some text for a go, just to make it easier to read. Okay, so this will loop through and create our rows. Next, we want to create a header for our table, and we're going to give it titles of session ID, link, and time. And then finally, we're going to theme the table. And you've probably seen this in previous videos, but what we're doing here is invoking the function theme table, but by wrapping the theme function around it. And then we're passing it an array of variables that will then get rendered into a table. So we're assigning header, the header variable, which we defined here, and the rows variable, which we defined here. This last part here is important when we're using a paged page to display row data. What this will do is connect with this extension that we defined for our query, and it will theme a pager. So that pager will be a numbered list that will show how many pages have row data on them and allow the user to click those numbers or next or previous to navigate through those pages. And then finally, we're returning the output.